Welcome to Reading the Room, a literary podcast featuring author interviews and discussions with bookish content creators. I am your host, Jalen, also known as The Bar and the Bookcase on YouTube. Today I am so excited to be joined by Daniel Hornsby, author of Sucker, available now from Anchor Books. Growing up, I always loved reading vampire novels, and this one is very much a vampire novel, but quite different from the ones I used to read. Sucker is a sharp-toothed satire of Silicon Valley and the 1%. I had a blast reading this novel, as the narrative voice is exactly what I'm looking for in this type of story. And to give you a brief intro into what Sucker is all about, we follow Chuck Gross. And Chuck would like nothing more than to prune himself from his family tree. He's already clipped his name, turning Charles Grosshart Jr., son of a billionaire labor exploiter, weapons manufacturer, and climate change denier, into the ordinary good guy Chuck, the self-made proprietor of an up-and-coming punk label. But when Daddy threatens to cut him off, Chuck is forced to get a real job. Inconveniently, an old college friend has just swept back into his life with the perfect opportunity. Famed Harvard dropout and biotech darling Olivia says she's on the verge of totally reinventing the field of medicine. But when Chuck signs on, he soon discovers that things at the vast Kenosis campus are not quite how they appear. Secret labs, vanished employees, and mutated test subjects seem to be as impossible as they are sinister. Is Olivia simply a scammer, or does her technology threaten to usher humanity toward a far bloodier fate? Moreover, does Chuck, who has never accomplished anything without the aid of Daddy's money, stand a chance of stopping her? Daniel Hornsby hilariously skewers the insatiable hungers of the ultra-rich in a novel that no one will be able to resist sinking their teeth into. If you enjoy Reading the Room and would like to support the podcast, a great way of doing so is leaving a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast, or sharing the episode with friends and family is another great way to do that as well. Also, Sucker is published by Anchor Books, an imprint of Penguin Random House, of which I am now an employee. Now let's get into the discussion with Daniel Hornsby. Dan, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, Jalen.
This is a romp, as I just said to you. I was trying to think of where to start with this book, because there's a lot of stuff going on here. And it's quite different from your last book, but I was reading it, and there's a quote that jumped out to me that I thought might be a good place to start. And so Chuck, he says, "What good is being an heir without death? I'd be obsolete." And I feel like that kind of touches on these ideas of mortality and succession, and just his voice in that passage encapsulates a lot of things going on with Chuck. So I wanted to start there and just ask you about landing on this protagonist and how you kind of came to him, or if the novel started somewhere else.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I started out just thinking about a kind of like little joke in my head, as far as the premise of the book goes. What if Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos was a vampire? And then that kind of the more I thought about it, the more I'm like, well, actually tech is so vampiric in our lives right now, right? We're being monitored all of the time. All our data is being kind of drained out of us. You think about what happens to cities that really embrace tech and give them, these companies crazy write-offs. And then you think about Theranos itself, obviously, like that company, and its weird relationship with blood. I mean, that's really where things started. But I realized that like Elizabeth Holmes herself is something of a cipher, even with some of the puff pieces that have been published as she goes to prison. And so it might be the best way to just like come at it with someone who is in that world and who would be kind of invited into, the kind of tech startup world. And then the more I thought about it, the more I realized like there are other kinds of parasitic rich people. Most rich people have a kind of parasitic relationship on the culture, I'd argue, but people who, you hear these weird stories, like Martin Shkreli comes to mind, where I knew a guy in Ann Arbor who was in bands, and he was telling me that someone he knew got a crazy advance for their record, $30,000 or $40,000 for like a punk band, and later found out that Martin Shkreli had funded the label they were on. And so I thought I could combine those things and kind of think about those two different, venture capital as a kind of parasitism, and also the American industrialism, the fossil fuel industry, things like that, by having an heir to one of those empires.
Yeah, I mean, he instantly, like when I picked up this book, I just love the voice. And I've been thinking a lot about certain books that kind of embody this style. It's just a treat to read, just like on a sentence level. And I'm wondering, like, in terms of landing on his voice as he's trying to sort of, I don't know, part ways in a bit, or in a sense, with his family and trying to kind of build his own thing. How did you land like on his voice in particular? Like, did that take some time to figure out, or was it always kind of like established for you?
Yeah. I love these novels that almost try to be national epics through a single life. So I think of like Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie, The Tin Drum by Gunter Grass. More recently, you have like The Sympathizer or Paul Beatty's The Sellout, and they're very kind of voice-driven books. Even Henderson the Rain King by Paul Bellow or Saul Bellow could kind of be stuck in there. Um, where there's just a kind of flow and dynamic, persuasive narrator trying to convince you and make you see their side of things, even as you peek sometimes around the bend, around the corner, and over their heads. And so I wanted something like that, somebody who could kind of sell you their story and tell you their side. And I wanted, someone who was kind of bad, who was implicated in these like evil flows of money, and maybe knows it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I wanted to touch on one passage that I really loved. I feel like my brain, whenever I see like writing or like fiction mentioned in a meta way within a book, like I always like, I don't know, pull it out and
Uh,
want to ask writers about it. But this
sure.
kind of speaks to Chuck's sort of personality, I think. He says, when my musical dreams starved to death by a shortage of talent, I thought I might aim lower and become a writer, my generation's Kathy Acker or Gary Indiana, a passable Tao Lin knockoff. But when the form rejections from the literary journals rolled in, when I didn't manage to snag even an honorable mention in the undergraduate writing contests, I decided to channel my energies towards helping real artists, as a kind of midwife to support and guide, to yank the work out into the world and help wipe off the goo. So that's interesting to me for
Uh,
many reasons. And so I'm wondering, like, even writing a passage like that and creating that kind of backstory for Chuck, like, what's going on your end when you're like making that, I don't know, passage?
yeah, I wanted to show that he has some kind of like verbal facility, that kind of account for that, or at least a fascination. So some of the things that you'll see will make sense coming out of his mouth. Yeah, and there is just this like, I don't know, I think about patrons. I've been thinking a lot about patrons of the arts lately. Because you see like I don't know if you caught wind of any of the Elizabeth Koch stuff with Catapult and the funding and restructuring there.
Yeah.
If you're an artist in this world, you really are kind of at the mercy of money, right? Like however you want to kind of skew that. And I mean, it goes way back, right? Like the lives of the artists, all of those people in the Renaissance had patrons who would buy stuff and commission things from them. Um, so I don't know. I kind of like Chuck being the narrator Chuck being one of those people who can kind of like use some sneaky money in a fun way. Um, and I don't know. I think there was a label owner, an indie label owner whose father was like involved in, Chile's 9/11, 1972, I think, with the overthrow of Allende. And so you see, I don't know. I think you're in the arts long enough. You see these people who kind of sidle up to literary culture, especially paint, visual culture, fashion, things like that. And you wonder like, where do they get their money from? Um, and I think for a long time there's this like kind of back and forth between rich people needing artists, artists needing rich people. And while we want to like kind of think that the artists are maybe feeding off of the rich, I think it's the other way around. And the way rich people feel legitimized by surrounding themselves with artists and beautiful things.
That's really interesting because I was thinking about Chuck's framing as being, tied to music and obnoxious records is his like motivation, I guess, in the plot. And I mean, thinking about his sort of moral ambiguity as tied to that. And I mean, how do you, I guess I'm jumping to his dynamic with Olivia and thinking about how you view each of these kind of Titan figures in this book, like, and how they kind of work together in this really weird kind of dynamic. Like, how do you view Chuck morally? Or do you want to leave that maybe to let the reader kind of have their own conclusion?
I mean, I think I can say that can I say he's a piece of shit? Okay, yeah, he's a
Yes.
piece of shit who is like protected himself with irony and some self-awareness. Right? He knows his situation. And I think by acknowledging that, he feels like he can kind of undercut you before you say, he's a rich pig. I do feel for him a little bit just because it's like it would be hard if you're I don't know, it wouldn't be like hard, like it's a lot harder to grow up in poverty than grow up being super rich. But having those parents and being born to evil parents can't be good for anybody, right? And his dad is an egomaniac and is willing to manipulate and use money and leverage that against his son his entire life. So I do feel for him, even though I don't like endorse his actions, right? As for Olivia, I think she, Chuck doesn't really have anything to prove except on a small scale. Like I don't know. I think he wants to make his own way in the world and is having trouble figuring out how to escape his, parents' shadow. Um, Olivia, though, I think her ambition, it's something you see, I think, at a lot of like elite schools where you have people who want to do something. They want the Aaron Sorkin movie made about them, but they don't really care like how. You know what I mean? It's like someone saying, I want to just be rich, like I want to start a company, but they don't really like care about any particular industry. They just want to start a company.
Mhm.
And so I think she embodies more of that kind of ruthless ambition that you see, I think especially in the tech world.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't want to. Maybe I'll cut this out if you think we should cut it out. But I really enjoyed how in the last chapter we get to hear from Olivia's perspective, and I won't
Uh-huh.
say why. We will. I guess I'll leave it in that way. I won't say
Yeah,
why
that,
we
that
hear
works
about
for me.
it. But yeah, she's really interesting, and I loved kind of where. I mean, do you think it's spoilerish to talk about the vampiric
No,
aspects of
no,
this
no,
book?
no. Yeah,
Okay,
go for it. I think it's there. It's like it's how we're kind of trying to get it in
yeah.
front of people's eyes.
Right. I think it's really compelling. Whenever I, first started reading fiction, like I remember R.L. Stein had this book called like Dangerous Girls or whatever. Vampires have been like my
Hmm.
favorite thing since I was like young, so it was cool to read
Yeah.
this book. And but I want to talk about a little bit more
Okay.
about Chuck's his family.
Sure.
And did you have a fun? I'm assuming you had a fun time writing those
Yeah.
sections because they're fun to read.
Yeah. I did a lot of research. I read a book by an anthropologist who studied not the super rich, though they kind of trickle, well, they're a huge part of this book, but she studied wealth managers. It's a book called Wealth Without Borders. And so she's looking at the class of people who move money around for the super rich. And so these are people who might have an office in the Cayman Islands, or they might have an office in Singapore or Switzerland, right? And they, in many cases, kind of know where these people's money is better than they do. And so you get this interesting glimpse into how the super rich organize and structure their lives. So that was one way in, just saying like, okay, how does this money flow? And reading the strange anecdotes from people in that line of work. I actually wound up interviewing a woman who had, for a time, married into a billionaire family. She was just a friend of a friend, and when I told him what I was doing, he's like, "Oh, you need to talk to her." And so we probably had a 3 or 4 hour conversation where she gave me a kind of more intimate view of the psychology of these people. Not just, when you see Succession or other depictions of the super rich, sometimes you view them on their terms, right? You see like the helicopters, you see the lush interiors and all of that. And even like at the table, what they talk about is elevated. But this was like, okay, what is it actually like at the dinner table with these people? What is it like to walk into a house like this when it hasn't been inhabited for months except by the staff, right? Um, and so that was also just incredibly helpful. And then I read a lot of kind of journalism about the super rich, and there's a lot of it.
And I'm assuming, going into like the biotechnology aspect of it and the research there. I mean, my
Hmm.
next question for you is about Kenosis and how you like developed even from like a craft perspective, the setting of it and how you thought about that and creating like a full kind of setting that really lends itself to the later half of the novel when things kind of explode.
Yeah. I mean, one thing about tech is that I think these people, they're always changing their environment, right? Like if you look at San Francisco, I was there maybe in a little bit before Facebook went public, and then I went back last year, and it's completely different. That's a cliche at this point. And they also, changed their built environments too. I knew that I didn't have the facility with the San Francisco uh, kind of topography, right? Like I don't know those neighborhoods that intimately. And so I kind of resorted to a tactic I've seen some other writers use. Roberto Bolaño in 2666, he, instead of having Juarez, he has his own like Santa Teresa. And I thought about, Thomas Pynchon has this book, The Crying of Lot 49, and he has a kind of fake California city. It's essentially somewhere between LA and San Francisco, called San Narciso. And there's, I think an aerospace firm there. It's got its own weird history. And I realized I could kind of build on that and use his wacky California vision, but just update it, 60 years later. Which would let me like invent things a little bit more liberally. And so I started there, and then, for people who haven't read the book, Kenosis, which is the name of the company, they have a kind of strange layout where they use, instead of the like hyper clean Google, red, yellow, blue, green, white, simple palette, that kind of corporate Memphis look, they go with something, they start like a new trend in tech interiors, which is more of a Gothic thing. So they'll have, chunks of churches brought in from, Europe. Or, in this case, she has what I call a silvarium, which is like an indoor forest without any invasive species. So she, says that it's like actually more nature than nature in a way. Yeah, so I was able to kind of have these strange little settings since I took so much license to put it in the Thomas Pynchon universe.
That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know. I haven't read Pynchon before, and I feel like that's a huge gap. I have read 2666, which I loved.
Yeah,
Um,
one of my favorites.
yeah, I mean, like that book, I keep thinking about it, and I guess a question for you as tied to that is just it's kind of a broad question, I guess, but why you're drawn to the form of a novel to explore your ideas about these things? Like, why do you think that you're compelled to write in this form?
Well, I think one thing that novels allow you to do that maybe nonfiction really doesn't. I mean, good nonfiction does, but I think for me, I guess the novel lets me like sit by mysteries rather than solve them, right? That you can kind of entertain strange ideas that maybe are textural or kind of come out of language, um, inhabiting different kind of points of view or experiences to kind of get at something that you can't, a problem that you can't plow through, something that you just have to hold or sit with. Yeah, I just find that the form is so plastic and versatile and strangely deep when it comes to the like knots and tangles of problems we face as humans. Because it's not just like, okay, here's some ideas or here's a solution. It's like, what does it look like to live with the problem? What does it look like to live against the problem?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because I think just thinking about Bolaño, and what that novel is doing in terms of thinking about like numerous systems and many ideas are all contained there. And I'm wondering for
Hmm.
you, like same with this book, it's a much shorter page count, but I'm wondering like how you think about narrative and the structure of this book with like using many short chapters and having a plot. Like, do you consider yourself to be tied to plot in particular, or is your kind of writerly inclination kind of more, as you just said, like tied to thinking about those ideas and sitting with them? But this is a novel that really it has a strong beginning and end, for sure.
Yeah.
But how you think about that?
Yeah, I always hated plots. When I was younger, I just thought, oh, I want to like throw my voice around, try on weird ideas, have a strange structure, and maybe I can evade plot. And I mean, there are many beautiful, wonderful books that do that. But as I kept writing and trying to kind of crack, like, how do you write a book that keeps people's attention? Right? How do you get the license to do those weird things? And I realized that plot's a good way to do it. And that plot can also plot should come out of character and plot should come out of the ideas, right? And so if your ideas are interesting enough and if your characters are interesting enough, they'll kind of propel themselves along the appropriate plots. I think the master of this is probably Patricia Highsmith. You ever read like The Talented Mr. Ripley,
I've
or
never
any of
read
the
her,
Ripley?
but I know I know about her, but I should
Yeah,
probably
yeah.
check her out. But yeah.
She's amazing. I mean, she's a true wizard. And what I love is like in The Talented Mr. Ripley, you have Tom Ripley, who is this kind of psychopath. And a lot of the plot is him putting challenges in his own way, right? He does something crazy about halfway through the book. And then the second half of the book is him digging himself out. But sometimes when he has the opportunity to kind of quietly slip off, he'll do something bold to kind of prove something to himself, right? And she's so good at The Two Faces of January has some of that too. That these plots can kind of come out of the strange characters you make up, I think is the big lesson there. And that if you want a character to do something, you can kind of like find a way in through their psychology and history.
How did you think about that in terms of like suspense in this book? Because there's a lot of, foreshadowing and some kind of spooky things. I guess I'm asking about
Mm-hmm.
horror in this book and how you
Yeah.
like knew the right points to add the vampiric stuff. And then when did you choose to like pull the rug out and let it kind of go crazy?
Yeah. Well, I always think, the best horror films will show you these little tantalizing glimpses of the monster. And so the most interesting thing to do for a while is just glimpse it and suggest it and let the reader's imagination run wild. Um, and then there's a certain point where you just have to show the beast, right? Like, and it changes. Like every horror film, there's that moment where like they're wondering what's if there's anything, right? Like they don't know how to respond to the threat. Um, and we're seeing like, oh my gosh, that wax museum is bad news, or don't stay at this hotel, guys. Like this is a bad idea. And then there's like a moment where things turn, right? Like if you think of The Shining, there's just a moment where Jack Nicholson is chasing Shelley Duvall around, right? And so I tried to figure out like where I could do that and where it would be the most interesting, and after a certain point, especially with this one, it's like the reader is getting the idea, and now we need to confront the forces that are conspiring against Chuck and the rest of the world, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite balancing acts that I see in both, film or in novels that I think is really hard to do is balancing horror with humor. And I think this book is absolutely kind of towing that line. And I was talking to like Mona Awad about this back in like October about
Oh,
how
cool.
she kind of thinks about, horror and how comedy kind of feels like very tied to it, even though they're kind of different emotions that are kind of coming out at the same time. But when we see something that scares us, like in a movie theater, we tend to laugh, or at
Right.
least for a little bit until things maybe increase beyond the point of no return, and then it just becomes like fright or what that feeling is. And I guess my question for you here is just about how you landed on humor in this book because it's funny as hell, and like
Right.
balancing that with the horror elements, it just works so well that it creeps you out in a sense, but also it's just like pleasant and funny to read at the same time. It's a weird balance, and I'm wondering how you thought about it.
Oh, yeah. That makes me think like that's maybe why clowns are so scary, right? Because they're kind of like these little they're there to kind of make jokes, and then they're horrifying,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
why it is so scary, right? I do think that like horror and comedy are deeply entwined, right? That the beats of a horror film often have the beats of jokes,
Mhm.
right? And there's something inherently comic to watching characters, like knowing, the dramatic irony of a plot where you know more than the characters do, right? And so for this, because it's a satire, because I'm kind of making fun of tech, I mean, the jokes are just there. Like
Mhm.
tech is so easy to make fun of, and I think should be made fun of more, just because it's an incredibly serious industry. It takes itself incredibly seriously, to the point where there's almost no irony, right? Like Zuckerberg names his company Meta, and that's from Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, in which the metaverse is like dystopian. Soylent, which is funded by VC, Silicon Valley VC, I mean, maybe that has a little irony, but it's like, why would you put that in people's heads? That seems silly to me. Elon Musk naming his ships after the Ian Banks novels. That I don't even know if he's read, to be honest. Like they're so serious that it's like we need to dunk on them a little bit. But as far as the horror, I think it is like underneath that, like what is happening, to the world at the hands of the super rich and facilitated through tech is a horror story, right? Like it is truly terrifying to me. Um, and I think like you kind of need both of those things to balance each other out. Like take it seriously, and take it seriously enough to joke about it.
You talking about this just brought to mind something that's going on in the news today. And I wasn't planning on asking you about this, but with the submarine news, are you caught up with
I
everything
thought you were
going on
gonna
with
say
that?
the Zuckerberg Elon Musk cage fight. Have you heard about that?
No, I have not.
That they're going to like face off in a cage fight, like an actual fight.
Really?
Isn't that
Okay.
insane?
That is insane. I did not hear about this.
I mean, you can't make this shit up.
Yeah, because it's been interesting to me as just like a cultural moment, especially online, thinking about one, the mega rich, and this very tragic accident, and just seeing the tone of how it's being addressed online is very interesting to me, just from thinking like on a macro level of how people are kind of consuming
Hmm.
this news and what it means, and how to process that kind of tragedy, and just tying it to the ideas in this novel. I think there's some interesting overlap there that I don't know if you want to speak about, but
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this book, I think my way in was parasitism and thinking about, the parasitism of tech, the parasitism of the super rich. And part of that is thinking that we have this mastery and control over the non-human world, right? And that's why you see people like Peter Thiel, Jeff Bezos, right? He has his new yacht, his 400-foot sailing yacht, one of the largest, kind of sailing structures ever made. That needs another 230-foot yacht behind it to carry all of the sea-doos and planes and helicopters, of course. Yeah, so the ocean and space have become these places for people to kind of like exert or play out their dominance over the non-human world, right? And try to reshape it in their image. And I think there is this like kind of hubris associated with that, obviously. Like it's a tragedy. It's really sad that this child died. I just find that like I don't think it's not especially fun to just laugh at their deaths. At the same time, I do see that like that kind of reckless voyage, you know, is the result of being kind of cavalier about the actual danger and power of these forces and thinking, that they can bend to your will.
it just kind of dawned on me here, so I have nothing else to add to that. But yeah, I mean, it's just it's an interesting thing to think about. And I mean, going back to the novel and how you knew when this thing was done, and if there's any section here that was like particularly challenging or like rewarding for you to write, that kind of unlocked the rest of the book, or gave you some trouble.
I think one thing that was tricky about writing the book is like my narrator is trying to tell you a story that serves his ends, right? Like uh I think he's trying to escape accountability, in his account. And so he's a liar and a little slippery. And he's telling the story of another slippery liar. And so keeping track of like his version of events and what he witnessed, and then Olivia, who is running this massive scam, what she knows at any given point, and mapping that through time, like back to college, um, all the way up to kind of the action of the novel was incredibly hard. Like my first book was a road novel, and I spent a lot of time like meticulously calculating if this is an 8-hour drive and he's here, what time is it? I don't know why I cared that much, but you get the idea. Like I just wanted there to be some kind of fidelity there. And the same goes for this book, where I wanted to make sure that there was something happening, and then there was a lie on top of that, and there's a lie on top of that, but there could be continuity between those things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, that's one question that I didn't think to ask you, but just one that I always think about is like this kind of idea of realism in fiction, and trying to keep some sort of like, narrative cohesion on that front. But at the same time, the book is very, there's vampires. So
Right. I
yeah,
know. I think like sometimes if you can present an object, like, if you're telling a story and if I can like present a fork to you and hold it up and you can see all the little scratch marks, from all the people who've bitten off the bit, used the fork, and you can see the scroll work at the bottom. It's an old kind of silver fork or whatever. And I do that with enough detail and uh convince you that that is real, then you get this kind of latitude elsewhere, right? Like if you start with something like that, like if you can be true to certain kinds of physics um in the worlds you're making up, then you have the wiggle room, right? Like there's stuff like they see a certain kind of frigate bird and I wanted to make sure that that bird actually exists in that part of the world, you know what I mean? Things like that where I take those things maybe too seriously sometimes, but I think it does let you then have vampires,
yeah,
because then you have a world where like those vampires can do things. It's not just kind of hokey and silly, that
yeah.
there are consequences to those, and those beings take up space and look a certain way, and I think it makes people more afraid.
Yeah, I think the work that you're doing on that end kind of saves it from being, kind of pure like slapstick or something, and kind of gives it real stakes. And I mean, framing it from the perspective of Chuck, and then hearing you talk about how you balance that with Olivia's perspective and just kind of how it all works together. I mean, did you ever think about writing this book from like a third person perspective or from Olivia's perspective, or was it always going to be
Hmm.
Chuck and his unreliability?
Yeah, I think it really, like, I knew I could write the book once I had his voice. Once I knew. I think I needed someone to be lied to and to give that account, right? Because it's like I think there's a kind of delight in seeing over a narrator's head, like as a reader. And I think about like Ishiguro's really good at that, right? Um, where you're kind of putting the pieces together around them. Um, and I also think, like there's a certain I wanted his consciousness to kind of interpret this world so he could kind of present it to us. And I think I'm like more easily convinced sometimes by, especially if it's fantastical, by a first person narrator. Like I just buy that what they're telling me is real, you know?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think the novel is served really well by his voice too, because he kind of leans into that, just like the voice of him being kind of, he's funny, but he's also, he lies, and like you mentioned, I
Hmm.
think he's like the perfect voice for this sort of story, and how, where the reader places themselves and kind of seeing all this play out. I just had a fun time like kind of knowing what was going to happen and seeing how much like Chuck was aware or not, or that's just a fun place to put a reader. I think Ishiguro
Right.
does that really well too. Yeah.
Right. And like Ishiguro will do little moves where a narrator is feeling something, but they're in denial. And I just think that that is so moving. And they're kind of, but it's also funny, right? Like, I don't know, The Unconsoled is funny. There are moments in The Remains of the Day that are funny because you have like someone who has uneven self-awareness, maybe is a way of putting it.
Mhm.
Um, so I really like that effect, and I think you can kind of create narrative gravity, keep people reading that way.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my next question for you before we get dive into book recs is just about, I guess, your interest as a writer. And this isn't really to ask you necessarily about what you're writing next, but I'm just wondering, like, you have two novels out now.
Mhm.
Like, where is your brain kind of like, where are you thinking about
Yeah,
stuff, or are you not?
I've been working on this new project that has like eco-terrorists at sea and a lot of stuff about kind of like all of the whale knowledge and knowledge of cetaceans, dolphins, whales that we've picked up since Moby Dick. Like the new age fascination with dolphins, whale mania. There are a lot of, I have a tattoo of a whale, as you can see here, um, and our fascination with these creatures and how it's changed over time, which is weird because I mean, like we were just talking about, there's so much. The ocean is in the news a lot. You had those orcas in Majorca who were destroying the rudders of ships.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I just kind of think like the ocean is obviously what connects all of us and is such a big part of uh, insulating us from climate change, but also is where like a lot of climate change is being felt, in the most extreme ways. So just thinking about like what our personal responsibility might be in the face of, human created ecological disaster, what people should do, what our accountability should be. Um, yeah. And like, how do people kind of navigate their lives? Uh, and sometimes, in this case, dedicate their lives to maybe changing things. Um, yeah. So I've been reading a lot about whales, rereading Moby Dick. Um, yeah, watching the show Whale Wars with the sea shepherds who, fight Japanese whaling ships in the South Seas. Yeah,
Gosh, okay. So, I have not read Moby Dick before. I've seen like, discourse around it. It's a classic, so
yeah,
that is what it is. But I mean, I'm assuming you love the novel?
I do.
Because,
Yeah, I
okay.
do.
Okay. Do you think I would enjoy it?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's incredibly funny, which
Okay.
is it doesn't really get sold on that, right? Like you look and you see like the cover, it'll be like a wood etching of a whale or like Ahab staring like a sunburnt face into the abyss. But it's incredibly funny and tender and strange. And I think it really does get at like the the problems that we're still facing in our relationship with non-human life, even though our understanding has changed a lot since then. It like, it has like deep and like at times erotic relationships between men. I don't know, it's just like it's a beautiful book, and I think it like doesn't contain the whole world, but maybe it does. I don't know.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I want to read it really. I do now that I've read 2666. Like, I kind of feel confident to take on like huge books that
You're
I'm
in your
scared
behemoth
by.
era, your
Yeah.
Leviathan era, where you're just gonna take on the chubby novels.
Yeah, I mean, Moby Dick is up there. Infinite
Have you read
Jest, I would like to
Middlemarch?
read. Middlemarch was last year's kind of big behemoth that I read.
Oh
Um,
man, that's that book. Oh my
that
God.
it's so fucking good. I can't even. I'm
I
so
know.
excited to like reread it throughout my life.
I know what you mean.
And yeah, it's fantastic. And I never really, I was just shocked by how much I loved it. Just because I heard Middlemarch, like I didn't really know much about it, but I thought it was just kind of like was going to be a slog, but it really surprised me. And it's interesting, like seeing how much it's informed novels that I've loved. Like I read it because of Crossroads with Jonathan Franzen being
Hmm.
named, a key to all mythologies and the Middlemarch
Right.
reference there. So I was like, I want to see what's going on here. And I'm so glad I did. But what do you think about Middlemarch?
Oh, I love it. I think it gets at kind of this strange, and I don't know. It's like when I think of that book, it's like it gets at the heart of like being alive and being a human, as corny as that sounds, right? But that it just it has like some kind of eternal quality while also being kind of like hyper specific and located in its time. But it seems like that book, it like spills out in this beautiful way that's hard to pin down. There's something just so elusive about it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, the narration of that book too, and like you're right. I mean, having it focus on a single town, that's kind of an interesting, like newer trend, or not newer trend, but something I've
Mhm.
been noticing in books that I love is just like books that kind of isolate or look at a certain location or a setting or something and how you can kind of explore like the world through that, or what it means to be
Yeah.
human. As cliche as it sounds. I mean, that book does it really well, and just the narration and like kind of the meta nature of like near the end of the book when the narrator kind of pops in and stuff. Like I just love that kind of shit. So,
Me too. Me
um,
too.
I was just gonna ask you for like more, books that you're loving or that have informed your work generally. But
I've been thinking a lot about Howard's End. Do you ever read Howard's End?
I know the
The
name. Who is it
Forster
by?
novel?
Oh,
Yeah.
I've never read Forster before.
This book I find like so moving. Really just there's this kind of idea that permeates it where you kind of think about, I mean, at one point the narrator I think almost just says it like, these relationships that don't necessarily fit like the the convenient social categories. So I'm thinking about like really intense friendship, right? Like you're really close with someone in your town and then they move away and you feel like you should be able to sit like have a claim on them. Like don't do this, you know? And if you're married or if you're siblings, you could do that. But when there are these and like so much of our lives, aren't going to show up in, graveyards and city records, like, and these super important relationships kind of get lost. They're hard to quantify. I love that book. I've been thinking a lot about something you just mentioned, which is the kind of editorial omniscience. It's something that happens in Howard's End. It's in a lot of Kundera's books. I'm trying to think of other really good, just where there's like a kind of meta consciousness that sometimes is filtering the thoughts of characters and sometimes is like giving you a strange little essay on why it's paying attention to something. And I think that's going to be part of this new book I'm working on.
That's interesting. I'm excited to see what you do with that because it is something that, formally that I really love. But I, kind of going what you're saying about that novel, which I haven't read, but I do think about novels that I love always kind of concerning themselves with certain things that
Mm-hmm.
structure our lives in ways that like I get, yeah, just that, I guess, like how they structure our lives, whether it be like the internet. So like for example, one of the books that really kind of opened my mind to novel reading. I mean, it's a pretty new book, but Fake Accounts by Lauren Euler, and how she
Oh
talks
yeah.
about like the internet and social media and our relationship to that as like a structure for our lives. But she uses those interesting narration tools, and like another one being Motherhood by Sheila Heti, and how she thinks about
Mm-hmm.
motherhood as a construction of our lives, but uses interesting kind of formal things there. I love when books do that, so I'm curious to see how that might show up in your future work too.
Yeah, I mean for me, I think to write a novel, there should be some kind of I almost think of it as uh, like almost like a spiritual geometry to it,
Hmm.
where like my first book was really about denial and occlusion, and the second book, Sucker Here, is like really about parasitism, right? And so I could come back to that like I don't abstract image whenever I'm stumped. And then this new one, I'm thinking a lot about knots and tangles and nets
Hmm.
and kind of the weird things that connect people. Yeah. But that's the kind of thing where it's like elusive, it's abstract, but kind of guides me through a project.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Sucker too, like, I mean, how do you feel about your novels once they're, out in the world? I mean, hasn't been published just yet. We're almost
Yeah.
there. But even your first novel, like, do they continue to kind of like, this sounds very, I don't know, like not speak to you per se, but do you still grapple with them after you're done writing them, or do you kind of just let it go and focus on the next thing?
I think they're like things that it's like with anything in life where like there are other little dramas that are going on that you're not paying as much attention to,
Hmm.
and then you step away and you notice like, oh, that's what I was fascinated by. And so yeah, I think but in a way, the books like I don't know, like Via Negativa feels more, yeah, it feels like one thing, where it's like when I was writing it, I could feel the way in which I was like piecing things together in the glue, you know,
Hmm.
and then you step away from it. And I can kind of think of it as like, okay, that's what that is. Um, yeah, and then Sucker, I don't know, it's so weird because even by the time a book comes out, you're like almost a different person again. Like you're almost a year away from that. You know what I
Hmm.
mean?
Yeah.
Uh, like the person who wrote that, and you're kind of the heir to whoever wrote that book. You know what I mean? I just finished Ling Ma's Bliss Montage, which
Yeah.
I really enjoyed. I think she is like just one of the kind of freaky talents of at least my generation. I don't know. Like Severance, her first novel is amazing. I loved reading this. Yeah, I've been reading, so I was just working on a piece about, satire and tech. And so I read some of these Ian M. Banks books, which, Musk uses to name his spaceships. And they're incredibly, like, they're very weirdly well written, like for being so deep in the sci-fi genre. But
Hmm.
they imagine a post-scarcity future society that there's no hierarchy. Any work you do is kind of voluntary. And obviously there's some problems associated with that, but they've kind of like steered this culture away from imperialism or colonialism. And thinking about like what a post-scarcity society might look like has been a fun thought experiment, because there is enough food and shelter on Earth, or we could make it so. And imagining like what would we do if we didn't have this specter of false scarcity looming over us all the time. The other cool thing about that book too, or those books, is that like in that future, people live longer and they'll change sex like all the time. Like just to get a new texture of experience, someone gets addicted to having babies. So you meet him in a male body. He transitions at one point, has a baby. Then you see him again holding the baby late. Like there's just stuff like that that is uh really cool to imagine, a different form of bodily expression in the future.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would like to check out his work because that seems like really tough to do in a novel. I always,
Yeah,
I tend to have authors on that write more kind of like realist stories
sure.
for
Yeah,
the
yeah,
most
yeah.
part. So it's always interesting to me like how a novelist can kind of contain those ideas in a written form without kind of going off the rails or making it kind of have some sense of like realism, to
I
make
know,
it,
it's
yeah,
strange. One, his like people are horny in his books, but it's not like pornographic. Uh People swear and freak out. Like there's something delicate about the psychology, even when there's like aliens and truly insane shit. Yeah.
gotcha. Okay. Well, thank you for those
Um,
recs, and I'll have to check them out.
yeah.
And Dan, thank you so much for coming on today. I know this has been, in the works for a while, and I'm so glad you came on. And hopefully, we could talk about whales when your next book
Hell yeah.
comes out. That'd be
I
fun.
can't wait. I can't wait. So, yeah, thanks for making time and thank you for such a thoughtful read on the book.